You know, when you sent over this Allied Venture Partners investor letter, I was pretty curious to see
Hmm.
what a deep dive into, well, venture capital would uncover.
Right.
But I gotta say, this letter is way more than just numbers and charts. It's like a
Yeah.
roadmap for how this whole VC world is changing,
You really is.
especially after the craziness of 2023.
Yeah, it's one thing to read the headlines about, tech funding and all that, but
Mm,
this letter, it's like we get a front row seat to how these firms are adapting.
totally. And right away, something that caught my eye was Allied's whole approach to investing. They keep mentioning these syndicates.
Yeah.
Sounds way more flexible than how venture capital usually works, right? So what's the deal there?
It's an interesting shift. I mean, think of the traditional VC funds like those exclusive clubs, just a handful of big players throwing their money in.
Yeah.
But syndicates, they kind of shake things up. They let smaller investors get a piece of the pie, alongside the lead investor, which here is obviously Allied.
So it's almost like democratizing access to these
Exactly.
investment opportunities.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it seems to be working, right? Allied's raised over $5 million since 2020, and they've invested in 16 companies, all through the syndicate model.
And they're not slowing down, are they? Because even in 2023, I mean, with the market all over the place, they still raised, what, another $550,000?
Yeah.
And invested in 5 more companies. That's impressive, especially since their founder basically described that year as like walking through a minefield with
Yeah.
the FTX collapse, bank failures, all of that.
Right, but it really shows you how good they are at adapting
No.
and, spotting the potential, even when things feel shaky.
Oh, absolutely.
Speaking of 2023, though, the letter does not hold back on how wild it really was.
No kidding. It really was a roller coaster. I mean, you had the whole SVB collapse,
Oh, yeah.
which really just sent shockwaves through the entire financial system, didn't it?
Right, and even though the Federal Reserve, they stepped in to prevent, like, a total meltdown, you can't deny how it impacted regional banks,
Yeah.
especially the ones tied to the tech sector.
But here's the thing, right? Despite all of that, public tech stocks still finished the year up over 60%.
Yeah,
Wild.
it shows how resilient the tech market can be. But it also, it really underscores how unpredictable it all is.
No kidding.
Yeah.
But this is where I thought things got really interesting because the letter, it starts digging into how the rules of the game, when it comes to valuations, they're changing,
Yeah.
especially for these startups.
It's such a good point, because for a long time there was this assumption that to get investment, startups, they had to grow super fast, take in tons of capital, even if it meant losing money.
Right.
But the letter suggests that's just not the case anymore.
So you're saying that whole growth at all costs thing,
Yeah,
that's starting to fade away.
it seems like it. They're highlighting how startups, they're getting much leaner now, doing more with less capital and becoming profitable sooner.
Which makes sense with all the economic uncertainty, right?
Right.
But what does that mean for the VCs, especially these bigger funds, like the ones used to just writing these huge checks?
That's what's so interesting. This whole shift towards these leaner, more efficient startups. It's created a dilemma for some of these traditional VC funds.
Okay.
See, their entire model was built on finding these like unicorns
Right.
and then investing huge amounts of money to basically fuel rapid growth.
So they're almost like
Wait.
whales trying to navigate a coral reef.
Exactly. They're finding it harder to adapt because the types of deals they used to chase, they're not as common anymore.
So what do? Just sit on the sidelines while these smaller, more agile funds, they snap up all these promising startups.
Well, they have to adapt, which is definitely easier said than done when you've been doing things one way for so long.
Of course.
The letter suggests that they're having trouble adjusting their valuations. Like they're stuck in that old mindset of high growth, high valuation.
Okay.
But as Allied points out, there's another side to this story.
Oh, okay. Now I'm really interested.
So Allied is actually arguing that this whole narrative about inflated valuations, especially at those pre-seed stages,
Mm-hmm.
it's being pushed in part by the very funds struggling to adapt.
Oh, interesting.
It's almost like by claiming valuations are still too high, it justifies their own issues with, getting in on these earlier deals, the ones that are more capital efficient.
Wow, so it's like there's so much more going on beneath the surface than we see in the headlines.
Right.
So if the big funds, they're having a hard time adapting, who's coming out ahead in this new landscape?
It's the smaller, nimbler VC funds that are having a field day. They can move more quickly. They identify those promising startups early, and they can invest at valuations that make sense in this market. And this is where things get really interesting for Allied. and their unique approach.
So it's like they're using their agility and how well they understand this new landscape
Mm.
to their advantage.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're playing a different game.
Right.
And it goes back to that syndicate model too.
Yeah.
By bringing in these smaller investors, it's like they can get to those early stage deals
Mm-hmm.
that maybe the bigger sons, they don't even see those yet, you know?
Because they're so slow to move.
Exactly.
They haven't adapted.
They're stuck in their ways.
It's fascinating how they've basically turned all this change into, like, their superpower.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of opportunities, though, the letter mentioned something else I found really interesting. Allied's focus on, get this, Canadian startups.
Oh, yeah.
What's the deal there? Is Canada like the next Silicon Valley?
Yeah. Well, Silicon Valley, it's still got its thing, right?
Yeah.
But Canada's tech scene, it's on fire.
Yeah.
And investors, they're noticing, like, Allied. What's interesting is it's still early days for a lot of Canadian startups.
So less competition, maybe? More
Yeah.
room to grow? Sounds like a gold mine for investors who, know what they're doing.
That's exactly the appeal.
Mhm.
The Canadian market's got this unique combo. You've got innovation, a supportive system for startups.
Yeah.
And often you get better valuations compared to the U.S.
Makes sense. And Allied, they're trying to tap into that, right? They mentioned wanting to add like 1 or 2 Canadian companies to their portfolio every year.
Exactly. They see Canada as a core part of their whole growth strategy.
Yeah.
And honestly, smart move. They're getting in early
Mm.
on a market that's, well, it's only going to get bigger. Now, when I think about their overall approach, though, this investor letter, it gave me some clues about where Allied might be headed. And it's pretty exciting.
Okay, I'm all ears. So they sticking with the syndicate thing, or are they thinking like even bigger picture?
That's the million-dollar question, right? They've done really well with the syndicates, but they're ambitious. The letter actually says they're seriously thinking about launching their own traditional VC fund.
Wow, okay. That's a big jump. Going from, this nimble syndicate structure to managing an actual whole VC fund, that's a different beast, isn't it?
Totally different ballgame. In fact, the letter, it mentions that Allied's founder,
Mm-hmm.
he just finished a VC accelerator program.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and those are designed to basically help people launch these new funds.
So he's been doing his research.
Oh, absolutely.
Getting all the knowledge, to make that leap.
Exactly. But here's the interesting thing. While that program, it gave him all the tools and stuff to start a fund, it also made him realize, really understand how complex it is
Yeah.
and how much time it takes.
Right, because it's one thing to have the idea, but to actually build it, manage it, especially in such a fast-moving field.
Totally.
So what's the verdict? Are they going for it, or are they hitting the brakes for now?
That's where it gets interesting. It's like they're at a crossroads
Yeah.
because on the one hand, they see the market now, especially with these leaner startups popping up, as like the perfect time for these early stage investments.
Sure, it's like they found their groove. They don't want to mess with it while things are good.
Right. Exactly. And they know that building a traditional fund, that takes time, resources, which they might need right now to not miss these opportunities.
So they're weighing, what, long-term growth against, like, making the most of what's happening in the market right this second?
Exactly.
That's a tough one.
It really is. But the founder, he makes it clear in the letter that his main priority hasn't changed. Supporting great founders and making sure his investors see returns.
Which right now probably means sticking with what's been working.
Right. They're not saying they'll never launch a fund, but for now, they're laser focused on what they're good at, finding those hidden gems, and using their syndicate model to basically make the smart investments.
It's like the old saying, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right.
But they're still keeping an eye on the future. What's really interesting to me about all this is how much we learn from just this one letter.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we got this backstage pass to how venture capital really works.
Yeah.
It's not just about the money or the valuations. We're seeing what drives these decisions, the challenges.
Right. It's like the whole thought process.
Exactly.
And I'll be honest, for someone like me who's, well, not a VC,
Yeah.
seeing how those decisions played out in a year like 2023, eye-opening, to say the least.
Oh, for sure.
It really shows you adaptability. That's everything.
It's key. And what Allied shows us so well
Yeah.
is it's not just about reacting to the market, it's about seeing the opportunities that others miss.
Right, like their whole thing with these smaller investments, early stage companies, that syndicate model, their interest in Canada.
Yeah. It's like they're not afraid to do their own thing.
Exactly. And that's something any investor can learn from, I think, no matter how much experience you have. It's not about following the crowd, right? It's about understanding the fundamentals, spotting those new trends, and having the, I guess, courage to make your own moves.
This is making me think, though, if these smaller, earlier investments, they're becoming so important, what does that even mean for, like, regular investors
Yeah.
who maybe don't have millions just lying around? Is
Right.
there any way for them to get in on this?
That's such a good question. And the answer is absolutely yes. It's not as hard to get into venture capital as it used to be. There are more platforms now that let, regular people participate in these syndicates alongside these experienced investors, just like Alad. So it's like opening up these opportunities that used to be for like a select few.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the money. You become part of this community, you learn from the pros, and who knows, you might get in on the ground floor of something huge.
That's what's so cool about this whole shift, right? It's not just changing how venture capital works, it's making it more, I don't know, inclusive,
Yeah.
open to everyone.
I think that's a great way to put it. And that means we might see more diverse founders, different ideas, getting the funding they deserve, which helps everyone in the end.
It's a win-win.
Exactly.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much better grasp on not just how VC works now, but also what the future might hold.
Me too. Me too. And if there's one thing I hope people listening take away from this, it's that. Venture capital. It's a lot more dynamic and a lot more accessible than it seems. So do your research, keep your eyes open, and don't be scared to, take a chance on something new. You never know what you might find.